I'm still convinced the game warden wasn't looking at me that morning. He was looking at the 3-inch binder sitting on the tailgate of my truck. 5 minutes earlier, a woman from the neighboring subdivision had been pointing her finger at me, telling anyone who would listen that I'd been stealing fish from what she kept calling the community lake. 5 minutes later, the warden slowly flipped through page after page of stalking records, water quality reports and property surveys, then looked up at her and said something I'll never forget. "Ma'am, according to these records, this isn't your community lake. If you've ever watched someone realize their entire argument is about to collapse in public, you know exactly what her face looked like. My name is Caleb Mercer, and until all of this happened, I thought the hardest part about owning a ranch in eastern Kentucky was fixing fences after every spring storm. Turns out, fences are easy. It's the invisible boundaries people convince themselves don't exist that cause the real trouble." My family had owned Cedar Run Farm for nearly 70 years. My grandfather bought the property after returning home from the Korean War with little more than a pickup truck, a handful of tools, and the stubborn belief that hard work could outlast just about anything. Over the years, he cleared fields, built barns, planted walnut trees, and with the help of half the county, carved out a beautiful 18-acre lake that sat in the middle of the property like it had always belonged there. My father expanded it in the 80s after securing every permit the state required. He stocked it with largemouth bass, bluegill, catfish, and crappie, not because he planned to make money from it, but because fishing was the one place where 3 generations of our family always seemed to understand each other. Some of my earliest memories were sitting beside him before sunrise, drinking hot chocolate that was always too sweet, listening to him explain that fish don't care how expensive your truck is or what your job title says. "Out here," he'd tell me, "patience beats pride every single time." I didn't fully understand what he meant back then. Years later, I understood it better than I ever wanted to. Things stayed quiet for decades. Then developers discovered the ridge overlooking our farm. Within 3 years, a subdivision called Maple Ridge Preserve appeared almost overnight. Big stone entrance, fancy clubhouse, walking trails with inspirational signs every 50 yards telling people to live connected and celebrate community. I always thought it was funny that communities needed signs reminding people how to be neighbors. At first, everything was fine. Some of the new homeowners introduced themselves. A retired firefighter named Walt occasionally stopped by to buy fresh eggs. A young family asked permission to take engagement photos near the lake, and I happily said yes. Most people were respectful because respect usually starts with a simple question. Then the Homeowners Association elected Rebecca Collins as its new president. The first time I met Rebecca, she wasn't introducing herself. She was telling me my dock would look better painted white because it would blend with the neighborhood aesthetic. I laughed because I assumed she was joking. She wasn't. "Our architectural committee has standards," she said. "That's nice," I replied. "My dock was here before your committee." She smiled politely, but it was the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes. "Communities evolve." "Mine already did," I answered. "About 60 years ago. We left it there, or at least I thought we did." A few weeks later, I noticed something strange while driving my ATV around the lake. Someone had tied bright blue ribbons to several trees near the shoreline. At first I figured maybe the county was planning utility work. The next day there were wooden stakes in the ground. By the end of the week, someone had placed a small metal sign just inside my fence that read Scenic Lake Trail. I pulled it out of the ground, loaded it into the back of my ATV, and drove straight to the subdivision office. Rebecca barely looked surprised when I carried the sign through the front door. "I think you lost something," I said, setting it against the wall. She glanced at it and folded her hands. Actually, our landscaping committee installed that. On my land. Near your land. No, I slid a folded survey map across her desk. On my land, she didn't even open it. Residents have always enjoyed the view of the lake. Looking at it isn't the same as owning it. Her expression hardened just enough for me to notice. Mr. Mercer, people have become emotionally invested in that area. I couldn't help smiling. Emotions don't move property lines. She leaned back in her chair. We'll discuss it at the next board meeting. I stood up. You do that, just leave my fence out of the agenda. I figured common sense would eventually win. Instead, things became stranger. The following Saturday, I woke up to laughter echoing across the water. 4 kayaks floated near my fishing dock. Kids were skipping rocks. Someone had unfolded lawn chairs beneath one of my oak trees. A couple I'd never seen before waved at me like we'd planned a picnic together. I drove down in my side-by-side and politely asked everyone to leave. Most apologized immediately. One man looked genuinely embarrassed. We were told this was neighborhood property, he admitted. Who told you that? He pointed toward the hill where Rebecca stood talking with several residents. Coffee in one hand, sunglasses on despite the cloudy morning. She watched the entire conversation without taking a single step closer. When our eyes met across the lake, she raised her coffee cup ever so slightly, almost like she was toasting the situation. That's when I realized this wasn't confusion anymore. It was strategy. Over the next month, little things kept happening. My gates were left open after strangers wandered through. Fishing line appeared tangled around my dock. Someone nailed another sign to a tree that read Community Nature Access. Every time I removed one, another seemed to appear somewhere else. Friends told me to ignore it. They're just being annoying, one neighbor said. Maybe he was right, but annoyance has a funny way of turning into entitlement when nobody pushes back. Then one afternoon, my elderly neighbor, Martha Jennings, drove over carrying a flyer she'd pulled from her mailbox. Across the top, in bold green letters, it read, Maple Ridge Community Family Fishing Day. Below the title was a smiling cartoon fish and a photo of my lake. I read it twice before looking up at Martha. You're kidding. She shook her head slowly. Honey, they're advertising your property like it's a public park. At that moment, something shifted inside me. Until then, I'd been treating every incident like an isolated misunderstanding. A sign here, a kayak there, a conversation that got out of hand. But holding that flyer in my hands, seeing my family's lake printed beneath someone else's logo, I finally understood what Rebecca had been doing all along. She wasn't trying to borrow the lake. She was trying to convince enough people it already belonged to them. And once enough people believe the same story, the truth suddenly has to work a whole lot harder to be heard. The funny thing about standing your ground is that most people imagine it looks dramatic. They picture shouting matches, lawyers marching into courtrooms, maybe somebody slamming a stack of papers onto a polished table. Real life isn't usually that exciting. Most of the time, standing your ground looks like making copies, backing up security footage, writing down dates, and resisting the urge to lose your temper when someone is counting on exactly that. The morning after Martha showed me the flyer, I drove into town before sunrise and stopped at the little print shop that's been on Main Street longer than I've been alive. Frank, the owner, looked at the stack of documents in my hands and laughed. Either you're writing the world's longest complaint letter, he said, or somebody's about to have a very bad week. I'm hoping for the second one, I answered. By the time I got home, I had 3 binders. One held property records dating back to my grandfather's original purchase. Another contained every survey, permit, and tax document I could find. The last one was empty except for labeled dividers. Photos, videos, witnesses, incidents. If this was going to become a legal fight, I wanted facts, not opinions. My dad used to tell me that memories fade, but paperwork has a stubborn way of sticking around. A few days later, I added the first entry. My trail camera captured 2 residents cutting the chain that blocked an old maintenance road leading to the lake. They weren't trying to hide it either. One of them actually smiled at the camera as if he thought he had every right to be there. I recognized both men from the subdivision, but what caught my attention wasn't them. About 10 minutes later, Rebecca's SUV slowly drove past the same road. She stopped for nearly 30 seconds, watched the open gate, then continued without ever getting out. She had seen it. She knew exactly what had happened, and she did absolutely nothing. Daniel Rhodes, my attorney, watched the footage twice before leaning back in his chair. "This is better than I expected." "How's that?" I asked. "Because this isn't just trespassing anymore." He pointed at the screen. If the HOA leadership knowingly encouraged unauthorized access to private property, they're creating liability for themselves. "Think Rebecca realizes that?" He smiled. "People who get used to winning small arguments sometimes forget the law doesn't care how confident they sound." We decided not to send a demand letter yet. Instead, Daniel suggested something I hadn't considered. "Let's attend their next HOA meeting." I almost laughed. "I'm not a member." "Exactly. They'll throw me out." "Maybe," he replied, "but if they're discussing your property in an official meeting, I want witnesses." The clubhouse looked more like a ski lodge than an office. Stone fireplace, leather chairs, fresh cookies sitting on a table near the entrance. If you ignored the agenda, you'd think it was a community Christmas party. Rebecca noticed us the second we walked in. "Mr. Mercer," she said with a practiced smile, "this meeting is reserved for homeowners." Daniel stepped forward before I could answer. "Actually, we're here regarding Agenda Item 7. Her smile disappeared just enough to notice. "Excuse me, Community Fishing Day." Several people in the room looked down at their printed agendas. Rebecca hadn't expected that. "That's an internal community event." Daniel nodded politely. "Being held on my client's private property." The room became very quiet. Rebecca recovered quickly. "Our understanding is that residents have established recreational access." Daniel didn't argue. He simply placed a certified property survey on the table, then another, then aerial photographs, then county tax maps. Nobody said a word while people leaned forward to examine them. Finally, an older gentleman sitting near the back raised his hand. "Rebecca, are you saying this lake isn't actually inside the subdivision?" She hesitated, just for a second. "The situation is complicated." I couldn't help myself. "No," I said calmly, "it's actually pretty simple." Every head turned toward me. "You either own something or you don't." Rebecca closed the meeting less than 5 minutes later. On the drive home, Daniel chuckled to himself. "What?" I asked. "Did you notice something? 3 board members never looked at you." "So, they were looking at Rebecca." He glanced out the window. "That's what people do when they realize someone they've trusted may not have told them the whole truth." Over the next week, the mood around the neighborhood shifted. A retired teacher named Helen knocked on my door carrying a pie she insisted I accept. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Rebecca told us your family had promised lake access years ago. We never did." "I know that now." She looked embarrassed. "Most of us never questioned it." That conversation repeated itself more than I expected. One neighbor admitted he'd assumed the HOA owned everything visible from the subdivision entrance. Another confessed he'd never even looked at the property maps before buying his home. Little by little, people began asking questions Rebecca clearly didn't want to answer. That's when things escalated. One Saturday morning, I woke to the sound of truck engines. 3 pickup trucks sat beside my east fence unloading folding tables, coolers, fishing poles, and bright green banners that read Maple Ridge Family Fishing Festival. Nearly 40 people had gathered before 9 o'clock. Children ran through the grass carrying tackle boxes while volunteers tied balloons to temporary signs. Rebecca stood in the middle of it all wearing a matching green polo shirt, greeting families like the host of a county fair. I drove over in my truck and parked a safe distance away. "Morning, Rebecca," she smiled without a hint of concern. "Good morning, Caleb. Beautiful day for bringing neighbors together. On my property, near your property," I laughed quietly. "We are still using that line," she folded her arms. "You're making this unnecessarily difficult by expecting people to stay off land they don't own." Several families had stopped unpacking to watch us. Rebecca noticed the audience and raised her voice just enough. "This community has enjoyed access to this lake for years." "Enjoying something," I answered, "doesn't magically transfer ownership." A father holding his daughter's fishing rod looked back and forth between us. "Wait, are we not supposed to be here?" Before Rebecca could answer, 2 sheriff's deputies rolled slowly down the gravel road behind them. Daniel had anticipated exactly this possibility and asked the county for a civil standby to prevent the situation from getting out of control. The deputies approached calmly, asking everyone to remain where they were while they verified property records. I handed over my survey. Rebecca handed over a glossy subdivision brochure. One deputy looked at it for several seconds before raising an eyebrow. "Ma'am," he said politely, "marketing material isn't a deed." You could almost feel the crowd shift. Parents who had arrived expecting a fun Saturday morning suddenly realized they might have been invited onto someone else's land under false pretenses. Rebecca's confidence cracked for the first time. She began insisting there had been misunderstandings, historical agreements, verbal permissions. But every explanation sounded weaker than the one before it. The deputies asked everyone to leave peacefully, and most did without argument. As cars slowly pulled away, I noticed something I'd never seen before. Rebecca wasn't angry. She looked worried, not because people had left, because they had started asking questions she could no longer answer. I watched the last vehicle disappear beyond the hill, and for the first time since this whole mess had begun, I had the unmistakable feeling that the real battle wasn't about fishing anymore. It was about whatever story had convinced an entire neighborhood to believe my family's lake belonged to someone else. And somewhere beneath that story, I was beginning to suspect, was a truth far more expensive than a community picnic. By the time autumn rolled around, people in Ashcroft Valley had stopped talking about the fishing festival. They'd moved on to a different question entirely. Why had the Homeowners Association spent so much energy trying to convince everyone the lake belonged to the neighborhood in the first place? That question spread faster than any rumor Rebecca Lawson had ever managed to start. And unlike rumors, this one came with documents. Daniel and I filed a quiet request for public records, not because we expected fireworks, but because paperwork has a funny habit of telling the truth after people stop trying to impress each other. A week later, 2 cardboard boxes arrived from the county archives. Most of the records were exactly what you'd expect: old plats, engineering sketches, environmental permits, handwritten inspection notes from the early 80s. But buried inside one faded folder was something neither of us had expected to find. 20 years before Maple Ridge was ever built, the original developer had proposed a luxury subdivision that included my family's lake as its centerpiece. The proposal never happened because my grandfather refused to sell. The county rejected the revised plans and the project died, at least on paper. Daniel stared at the file for nearly a minute before speaking. "This explains everything." "Explain it to me." Someone kept selling the dream long after they lost the right to sell it. Suddenly, every strange conversation over the past year made sense. The brochures showing families fishing at the lake, the walking trail signs, the repeated claim that residents had always enjoyed access. Rebecca hadn't invented the story herself. She had inherited it, believed it, and then doubled down every time reality challenged it. That didn't excuse what she'd done, but it made her actions easier to understand. Pride can be expensive. Pride mixed with bad information can be catastrophic. The county scheduled a mediation session before anyone spent another year fighting in court. Representatives from the HOA, several homeowners, Daniel, and I all gathered inside a plain conference room with fluorescent lights that somehow made everyone look more tired than they already were. Rebecca walked in carrying a binder almost as thick as mine. She looked older than she had only a few months earlier. The confidence was still there, but it had cracks now. Real ones. The mediator spoke first. "We're here to determine facts, not assign emotions." I liked him immediately. For nearly 3 hours we compared surveys, deeds, tax records, archived development plans, and correspondence dating back decades. Every time another document appeared, the same conclusion became harder to escape. The lake had always belonged to Cedar Run Farm. It had never been transferred, leased, dedicated, or granted for community use. Finally, the mediator turned toward Rebecca. "Do you dispute these records?" She looked down at the table. For the first time since I'd met her, there wasn't an answer waiting. "No," she said quietly. The room fell completely silent. One homeowner, an elderly veteran named Frank Miller, slowly removed his glasses. "Then why did you keep telling us otherwise?" Rebecca took a deep breath before answering. "Because that's what I was told when I joined the board. Every president before me repeated the same story. By the time I learned the truth..." She stopped. "I thought admitting we were wrong would destroy the community." Frank shook his head gently. "Instead, hiding it almost did." That sentence stayed with me long after the meeting ended. A month later, the HOA officially apologized to every homeowner and to my family. The board voted to remove every brochure, website photo, and promotional statement suggesting ownership or access to the lake. New boundary signs were installed, not because I wanted bigger fences, but because everyone finally agreed clear boundaries create better neighbors than assumptions ever will. Rebecca resigned before the next election. I didn't celebrate when I heard the news. Honestly, I felt something closer to relief than victory. She'd made serious mistakes, but somewhere along the way I'd realized she wasn't the original author of the problem. She was simply the last person stubborn enough to defend it. A new HOA president reached out a few weeks later. His first sentence surprised me. "We're not calling to ask for anything." That was a refreshing change. Instead, he asked if I'd be willing to meet over coffee and talk about how both sides could rebuild trust. We met at the old diner outside town, the one with the cracked vinyl booths and pie that somehow tastes exactly the same every year. We talked for nearly 2 hours. No lawyers, no accusations, no speeches. Just two people trying to figure out how neighbors could stop acting like opponents. Before leaving, he said something my father would have appreciated. "Property lines keep people from arguing about land. Respect keeps people from arguing about everything else." A few months later, I invited several neighborhood families to fish at the lake on one condition. They had to ask first. Every single one of them smiled and said yes. It turns out permission isn't a burden. Sometimes it's simply another word for respect. Every now and then I still walk down to the dock just before sunrise with a cup of coffee in my hand. The water looks exactly the way it did when I was 10 years old. The bass still strike when they're in the mood. The herons still ignore everyone. The only thing that's really changed is me. I used to think protecting property meant defending fences. Now I know it's really about defending truth, even when the truth is inconvenient, unpopular, or slower than a good story. So let me ask you something. If you discovered your entire neighborhood believed something that wasn't true, would you keep quiet to preserve the peace, or would you risk becoming the villain in someone else's story to protect what's right? There isn't always an easy answer, and that's exactly why I'd love to hear your opinion. Leave a comment below and tell me what you would have done. If this story made you think, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more true-to-life legal and neighborhood dramas, and share it with someone who's ever had to choose between staying comfortable and standing up for the truth. Sometimes the smallest property line ends up teaching the biggest lesson.